Recently, I saw this movie which I felt is the closest representation of antisocial personality disorder in Tamil cinema. Today, we are going to be analyzing the film Stephen on Netflix. Clearly, spoilers ahead. Please go check it out first and come back to this. Antisocial personality disorder is commonly known as psychopaths or sociopaths. Usually, when a psychopath is portrayed on movies, they are usually shown as emotionally unstable or dramatically insane. Instead, in this movie, the focus is mainly on behavioral patterns, deception, manipulation, emotional detachment, and instrumental violence. And these features make the character unusually compatible with clinical descriptions of antisocial personality disorder. Oftentimes, we can see something called conduct disorder before the age of 15 in antisocial personality disorder. The film shows Stephen killing a puppy in his childhood. Cruelty towards animals is one of the recognized behavioral indicators associated with conduct disorder, which frequently proceeds into antisocial personality disorder. Stephen later admits there was an incident involving sexual misconduct towards his classmate was committed by him rather than by his father. Yet his father accepted the blame for the event. This detail suggests early boundary violations combined with the ability to manipulate authority figures and family members. This behavior reflects not only early aggression but also early instrumental use of others to avoid consequences. Even as a child, Stephen demonstrates the ability to construct narratives that influences how others interpret events. Stephen admits to killing his mother and coercing his father into accepting the responsibility in order to stage the murder suicide. This part of the movie illustrates several antisocial traits simultaneously: strategic planning, manipulation of close relationships, lack of emotional attachment, deception directed towards law enforcement. The violence is not portrayed as emotionally reactive. Instead, it appears calculated and goal oriented. The fact that Stephen successfully influences the police officer into ruling the death as murder suicide indicates sustained manipulative abilities rather than impulsive behavior. One of the most psychologically significant feature of Stephen's character is his extensive fabrication of childhood trauma narratives during his forensic evaluations. He constructs a coherent story involving an abusive father, a controlling mother, chronic victimization. This narrative is emotionally possible and psychologically convincing. This pattern reflects pathological or instrumental lying, in which the individual constructs elaborate and believable narratives to influence the perception rather than merely denying their wrongdoings. Stephen isn't simply lying to avoid punishment, but he's constructing an alternative personal history that serves strategic purpose. The forensic psychologist's observation that Stephen's validity and the lie scores were unusually elevated is consistent with the pattern of distortion and impression management. Stephen also repeatedly manipulates authority figures throughout the film, influencing the police officer to classify the parental murders as a murder suicide, providing fabricated trauma narratives during the forensic evaluations, tailoring explanations to match the expectation and emotional bias of the listeners. In the case of the police officer, Stephen exploits the emotional involvement of the police officer in a prior investigation by presenting a narrative consistent with the officer's suspicion. This type of targeted persuasion demonstrates advanced interpersonal manipulation rather than simple dishonesty. Stephen's behavior indicates an ability to assess the psychological vulnerabilities of others and adjust the narrative accordingly. Stephen recruits his victims by posing as a filmmaker conducting auditions. This strategy demonstrates deception, planning, strategic victim selection, and exploitation of trust. Victims are not targeted impulsively, but through a structured recruitment process. This pattern reflects instrumental violence rather than impulsive aggression. Stephen treats his victims as logistic problems rather than individuals. When he's describing how he is disposing of their bodies, he describes it as I just leave it in the forest, and whenever I come back, the bodies won't be there. This level of indifference suggests low emotional involvement, minimal concern about consequence. One of the most realistic aspects of the character is his emotional presentation. Stephen confesses to multiple murders while appearing neither anxious or theatrically calm. Instead, he appears emotionally neutral and conversational. This is very much in line with my clinical experience because when they're sitting in front of you and talking about something that usually will shock somebody, the tonality does not shift whatsoever. It will be simply as the same tone of them describing a very day to day basic activity. And at the same time, when we know that he's clearly fabricating the entire murder suicide, right? He describes the entire event and proceeds to say the reason why he killed his father is because he was going to urinate on his mother's body, which is a lie nobody would conceptualize and deliver at all. Even if you're lying, there are some limits that normal people adhere by, but this is completely removed in the case of antisocial personality disorder. They will go to any extremes or say the most volatile, inconceivable things if they feel that it suits their narrative and it will influence you to get what they want. They will go ahead and just say that in a very convincing manner, mind you. In the climax, when he's talking to all his victims, he explicitly makes it a point to say that you are not important to me, to the point I don't even remember your name. This statement reflects extreme objectification. Individuals are treated as functional entities rather than a psychologically meaningful individual. This is also consistent with antisocial personality disorder. The absence of empathy would be a popular thing that we associate with psychopaths. This is also very consistent of that. Even intimate relationships are treated as replaceable. After killing his girlfriend, Stephen describes his other victims as mere replacement. This pattern suggests attachment deficits combined with instrumental use of relationships. His reasoning for why he killed his parents is that you were making a lot of rules and that was annoying. This explanation contrasts directly with his early fabrication of his traumatic childhood. And this absence of emotionally meaningful justification suggests an indifference rather than psychological conflict. Stephen does not describe guilt, regret, or internal struggle. His explanations are pragmatic rather than emotional. Stephen ultimately reveals that his confession was strategic. He determined that he was eventually going to get caught and possibly killed in a police encounter, therefore surrendered strategically in hopes that he would just get a life sentence. This indicates long term planning, risk calculation, self preservation, and strategic compliance. Even his confession becomes a broader manipulation strategy. Stephen openly says that he manipulated the police investigation and the psychologist in order to achieve his outcome. Also, there is a point where they discuss that Stephen tries to commit suicide, which is later described as an assassination attempt. But I think it's important to note that with antisocial personality disorder, correlation with suicide is not that high, doesn't happen that often, but threatening with suicide might happen if It drives their narrative, and if they believe that it would get them what they want. Stephen also expresses his confidence that he will be released sooner after demonstrating good behavior in the prison. He says that he is willing to spend several years incarcerated if doing so is going to eventually lead to his freedom. This statement reflects a pragmatic and instrumental orientation towards punishment. There is no indication that this incarceration is experienced as a moral consequence. Instead, he treats it as a temporary strategic cost. So, to conclude everything, Stephen demonstrates a pattern consistent of antisocial personality disorder with traits that include early conduct type behavior, persistent deception, instrumental violence, manipulation of authority figures, lack of remorse, objectification of others, strategic planning, and repeated criminal behavior. While the level of violence might have been heightened for the cinematic purpose, the personality traits themselves are comparatively realistic. So, the character's most psychologically credible feature is not the violence, but the consistent pattern of manipulation and emotional detachment. 10 out of 10, highly recommend. Check it out. And I'll see you again with another video. Bye.
Hey, hi, Nitin.
Hello, Auntie.